Buried next to me is Robert C. Tyler, the last Confederate general to die in the line of duty a week after the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And this is a true Civil War mystery. In fact, up until the 1990s, no one knew who Robert Tyler was. It was only then that historians began piecing things together, and they found out that R.C. Tyler was the Maryland commander of the Knights of the Golden Circle. In fact, he commanded 1,200 men and was present on William Walker's filibustering expedition to Managua. And in fact, he was there when they took over the entirety of Nicaragua. As briefly as possible, their efforts in Nicaragua composed basically, if you were a gold miner, you would go down the coast of Florida and go down through the Caribbean to South America, and you would get off on the eastern coast of Nicaragua. There you would hike about 30 miles to the lake at the capital, and you would get off on the opposite end where ships would ferry you back up to California. And William Walker and men like Robert C. Tyler saw the immense financial opportunity that would come if you just took over all of Nicaragua. And they also saw fit to take over chunks of Mexico, form republics there, form constitutional governments there. A lot of time, you can read Blood Meridian and get an idea of these filibusters. There's an entire chapter devoted just to them. They were gangsters, outlaws, and desperados, and they have very fascinating backstories, which unfortunately not a lot of them left memoirs. But Robert Tyler changed his name to just R.C. Tyler and then came up to Texas. He came to the southeast and he was cycling around when he joined the Knights of the Golden Circle, which had very similar goals, filibustering. In fact, Bickley, who created this organization in 1854, had the goal of taking over all of South America and Mexico, where he would establish 24 separate states that encompassed everything from the Mason-Dixon line south, and it would be a slave empire where slavery would support the leisure of the upper crust of plantation owners. Their capital would be in Hawaii, and they would never have to work a day in their lives because their entire life was provided for them. And R.C. Tyler rose from the ranks in the Civil War of private to general very quickly, and nobody really knew who he was. Now, what's so fascinating is the only mention I have found of him outside of very sparse genealogical records is that he was present at the last Knights of the Golden Circle meeting. Basically, in the KGC, there was a sort of coup about a year before the Battle of Fort Sumter, which began the Civil War. Again, the KGC started a decade before the Civil War really kicked off. And this meeting, Bickley, who had created that organization, melodramatically resigned from his de facto leadership position in that group, and he said that a lot of people have left and seen fit to go to the newspapers and say that we're a chauvinistic, militaristic invasion force. Yes, if President Juarez requested we join his constitutional army, or any regional state power requested we join that army, then yes, we would see it as our duty to take all of Mexico. But we're a philosophical group, so I'm stepping down. And when he did this, he said, now the state regional directors have the power to appoint people underneath them, which is now putting the power in the hands of regional people. In fact, this really contributed to the recruitment of Confederate officials only a few months later. And he said, basically, that you will report to your state representatives rather than to me directly. So power really decentralized from that moment on. And at this meeting, it was chaired by R.C. Tyler and General Semmes, who's buried just down in Columbus, and there were a couple other Columbus merchants who were present. You can see again, this is plantation owners, this is military men, this is filibusters, these are outlaws, desperados, and wild men who have already been out west fighting Indians and fighting for the Constitutionalist Army and fighting the forces of Nicaragua and Costa Rica. Well, what's so fascinating is that Semmes, who was appointed the Georgia director of the Knights of the Golden Circle, was killed in battle. These were the kinds of men spoken about by Ambrose Bierce at Killed at Resaca. They craved the fight, and they often died very quickly, again, leaving us nothing to go off of. And of course, Semmes died, and in his death he lingered and left behind letters to his wife. Well, R.C. Tyler made it through the war. Why is he buried here? In fact, the surrender was a week before his death, and he was camped out at West Point, just on the opposite side of Alabama. Well, hearing the news of Sherman's march to the sea, it seemed as though forces under Wilson wanted to have something to write in their own memoirs. So they launched their own raid to Columbus, and then one wing broke off, and that left wing came up to West Point. They had been demobilized, the Confederates, and still this group of Wilson's raiders set up artillery and began to bombard the fort, and Tyler thought that the war was over, so he didn't break down houses that were close to the fort, and if he would have broke down those houses, he would have seen these men coming. And so for the rest of the day, they were shelled with artillery, and the Union Army came up with repeating rifles, whereas most of these men were sick, and the lucky ones had basically muzzle loaders, and it was an uphill battle. Well, R.C. Tyler, being a general who had advanced from the rank of private, there was nobody else who did that ever, private to general in one war, other than, I believe, General Forrest. He poked his head out to see what was happening, and he was sniped immediately. Now, to be a general who is sniped in battle a week after your main forces surrender, when you think that the war is over and that this is now mainly a grouping fort where people have been demobilized and are waiting to go back home, it smells a little bit fishy to me. Why was he assassinated? Well, Celestino Gomez, who's buried next to him, who was his captain, poked his head out. He was the second in command, and he likewise was shot between the eyes. And buried around me are other men who were also killed as a result, which leads me to think perhaps there was some desire to cover up Union involvement in the Knights of the Golden Circle, because of course the KGC had men who were influential military men from a decade prior to the start of the Civil War, and men like Robert Tyler would have known this. And it's interesting to think, what would Robert Tyler tell us if he did not get assassinated on that day, on April 16th, 1865? I've always been curious about Captain Celestino Gonzalez. He was a man from Florida who appears to have been Tyler's personal friend. Considering the Knights of the Golden Circle desired to create a slave state with their capital in Havana, I wonder if he knew of Robert Tyler's filibustering expeditions and his ultimate goal of what the KGC hoped to create. And as a final note, Robert C. Tyler was the secretary of that last military meeting of the KGC, which was held in Atlanta. And at that meeting, it's very interesting to point out, there were no representatives of the largest branches of the KGC, Arkansas and Texas, which indicates that these two states had a desire to essentially remain independent. And that's what they did. A lot of men from the KGC went there after the war. In fact, by April 1860, it seems like the KGC of Texas was a totally separate organization with separate goals from Bickley. It truly split, a coup, and a military fraternal order, and it makes me wonder what they did and what their members would have thought about the Civil War, although I'm sure most of them sympathized with the Southern cause. There's a disagreement amongst historians over where the final battle of the Civil War took place. Now, a lot believe that it happened down in Columbus, Georgia, on the evening of April 16, 1865, about a week after the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. But not a lot know that just a few hours earlier on that very same day, the Union Army, using very heavy-handed techniques, took the Confederate Fort Tyler. Now, I don't want to fall into the camp of lost cause revisionism, but I do want to tell a little bit about the tactics they used, because I think they were pretty cruel, all things considered. At the time of the battle, this fort was held mainly by Georgia militiamen, people who'd been injured in battle or who were too young or old to fight in main battles earlier in the war. And they also believed that the war was over, so by staying here they were mainly just defending their homes. Possibly a lot of them thought up until the Union Army could take to and occupy the area. Now, because the army under Wilson's raiders had divided in two, the northern flank came here, and they were mainly armed with Spencer repeating rifles, which of course have a much greater rate of fire than what the Georgia militia was armed with, smoothbore muskets. So as they came up, they contacted this fort around 10 a.m. and promptly began shelling it, and this would continue up until around 1:30 p.m. In fact, General R.C. Tyler believed that an attack was so unlikely that the structures surrounding the fort, which were later used for sniper posts, he didn't feel the need to burn. And this was his fatal mistake, because as he was surveying the battlefield, he was sniped right between the eyes. Buried here are the two Confederate officers who were sniped while overseeing the Battle of Fort Tyler. On the left, you have General R.C. Tyler, who was shot between the eyes as he looked up over the walls to see what the Union troops were doing. Immediately afterwards, Captain C. Gonzalez did the same, his second in command, and he was also sniped. The third man, placed in charge, did not decide to look up over the edge, but it kind of speaks to the fact that none of these men were assuming Union soldiers would stoop so low as to shoot the commander in the head at a moment's notice. Now, I can't speak to what snipers were viewed as back in the Civil War, but it's fairly easy to assume that it was viewed as cowardly. By using rifles with a much higher range, with a much more deadly precision, and by using cavalrymen to get within 50 meters of this fort, and sniping anyone who peeked their heads over the top, this was kind of the first time that this was used as a regular military tactic. Other snipers are very renowned in the Civil War, but they were partisans, they were guerrillas, and bushwhackers. This employed the tactic over an entire fort of people who were supposed to be demobilized. So after the general here, R.C. Tyler, died, the Union Army began making pushes to try to enter the fort. They pressed up against the walls and aimed their guns up over the top, taking shots at anybody they could hit. Now, this passed on for several hours, and eventually they tried to make their entrance through the front of the fort by disassembling other wooden structures around and literally making a bridge. And before the Confederates could burn it, one of the men got inside, and he was kind of a Union Army high-ranking officer. They fired a cannon at it because the cannon had very short range. It wasn't very accurate, but it killed his horse and stunned him. He was lying on the ground. Of course, his men carried him back over, and there was skirmishing going on for a little while, and when finally a bugle call came and the Union Army hopped over the sides of the fort, the Confederates all surrendered. And the Confederates numbered here between 120 and 265, and most of them who died by sniper fire, and this was kind of considered the Union Army was attacking a force which they greatly outnumbered, which they outgunned, and a lot of the force here was not a Confederate regular military unit. They were just militiamen defending their homes. The fact that any of these graves are still unknown is kind of just a tragedy of history. These men were here as refugees. The war was over, and they certainly had paperwork on them saying who they were, so I'm guessing that it was the Union Army that just quickly and unceremoniously buried them here, and they're the officers that were shot near them.